The people everyone ignores are often the ones carrying the answers no one else can see. That was the first lesson Walter Bennett ever taught me, although he never said those words out loud. At 2:15 on a rainy Tuesday morning, the emergency department of St. Gabriel Medical Center felt suspended somewhere between exhaustion and hope. Fluorescent lights reflected across spotless floors that Walter had already cleaned twice since midnight. The steady squeak of his old maintenance cart echoed through the hallway with a rhythm so familiar that most doctors no longer noticed it. They barely noticed him either. I was halfway through my 12th hour on the night shift when I saw him kneel beside a frightened little girl who had dropped her stuffed rabbit near the nurse's station. Without saying much, Walter brushed the toy clean with a fresh towel, smiled gently, and handed it back as though he had just returned something priceless. The little girl smiled for the first time since arriving. Walter simply nodded and continued pushing his mop down the corridor. That was who he was. Quiet, patient, invisible. He wore the same neatly pressed gray maintenance uniform every evening, and although he looked well into his 70s, he never complained about aching knees or sore shoulders. His silver hair remained carefully combed, his work boots polished despite years of use, and his name tag had become so worn that only the first few letters were still easy to read. Most people walked past him without making eye contact. Some left coffee cups where he had just cleaned. Others spoke over him as though silence were part of his job description. I always greeted him. He always answered with the same calm smile and wished me an easy shift, even though we both knew there was no such thing inside an emergency room. Just after 2:30, the automatic doors burst open as paramedics rushed inside, pushing a young boy on a stretcher. His mother stumbled beside them, holding his small backpack against her chest while tears streamed down her face. The overhead speakers immediately announced a pediatric emergency. Nurses sprinted toward trauma room 3. Respiratory therapists rolled equipment into place. Monitors came alive with steady beeping that instantly filled the hallway. I grabbed a pair of gloves and hurried forward as the lead paramedic gave report. Male, 12 years old. Sudden collapse at home. Severe abdominal pain. Fever. Unstable vital signs. Everything moved with practiced urgency. We transferred the boy onto the hospital bed while his mother repeated his name over and over. Noah Parker. 12 years old. Honor roll student. Loved baseball. Allergic to peanuts. Parents always remembered the little things when they were terrified. Dr. Richard Hale arrived less than a minute later, his white coat flowing behind him with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. He barely looked away from the chart as he began issuing instructions. Blood work, imaging, surgical preparation. Nobody questioned him. They never did. I caught sight of Walter quietly wheeling his cleaning cart away from the busy hallway, making space for the incoming team. As the stretcher rolled past him, something slipped from beneath Noah's blanket and landed silently on the polished floor. Walter bent down with surprising ease and picked it up. It was Noah's hospital identification bracelet. Instead of immediately handing it to me, Walter studied it for one long second. His gentle expression disappeared. His fingers tightened around the plastic band as his eyes moved from the printed information to the frightened boy disappearing into trauma room 3. Then he slowly looked toward the treatment room door, his face suddenly carrying the weight of a memory he had spent years trying to forget. He walked toward me with careful but urgent steps and quietly placed the bracelet into my hand. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "Do not let them take that child into surgery until someone looks closer. Some people mistake confidence for wisdom. I learned that night they are not always the same thing." Walter's quiet warning lingered in my mind as I hurried into trauma room 3 with Noah's identification bracelet still resting in my palm. The room moved with organized urgency. Heart monitors pulsed steadily. Nurses prepared medications. A portable ultrasound machine rolled into position while laboratory samples disappeared through the pneumatic tube system. Noah lay pale beneath the bright examination lights, his breathing uneven as his frightened mother stood against the wall with trembling hands clasped tightly together. Dr. Richard Hale entered without hesitation, reviewing the first laboratory values on a tablet before confidently stepping to the bedside. At 48, He was considered one of Chicago's most accomplished trauma surgeons. Medical journals praised his skill. Television interviews celebrated his achievements. Inside the hospital, many younger physicians treated every word he spoke as absolute fact. He studied Noah for less than 2 minutes before making his decision. "Prepare operating room 4, he said. "We are dealing with an acute abdominal emergency. We do not have the luxury of waiting." Several staff members immediately began carrying out his orders. I glanced once more toward the hallway where Walter remained standing quietly beside his maintenance cart. He had not moved. He simply watched the treatment room through the partially open doorway, his expression filled with a concern I had never seen before. I walked over to him during the brief moment while another nurse retrieved additional supplies. "Walter," I whispered, "what did you see?" He looked down at the bracelet before answering. The medical alert code printed beside his identification. I frowned. "What about it?" His eyes remained fixed on the treatment room. "It does not match the diagnosis they are chasing." My pulse quickened. "How could you possibly know that?" Before he could answer, Dr. Hale's voice echoed from inside the room. "Nurse Carter." I hurried back immediately. "Yes, doctor." He pointed toward the surgical consent forms. "Please have the mother sign these. Every minute matters." I hesitated only briefly. "Doctor," Walter Bennett noticed something unusual on the patient's medical bracelet. "He believes we should double-check the diagnosis before surgery." The room became very still. Dr. Hale slowly lowered the tablet and looked past me toward the hallway where Walter stood holding the handle of his old mop. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dr. Hale smiled politely, though there was no warmth behind it. "The janitor?" he asked. I nodded carefully. He seemed genuinely concerned. Several residents exchanged uncertain glances. Dr. Hale walked toward the doorway until he stood directly across from Walter. "Mr. Bennett," he said with measured patience, "I appreciate your concern for our patients. Truly. But cleaning hospital floors and practicing medicine require very different training." A few uncomfortable chuckles drifted through the hallway. Walter did not react. His hands remained folded calmly around the handle of his cart. "Doctor," he said quietly, "I am only asking you to pause long enough to verify one detail." Dr. Hale shook his head. "Medicine is guided by evidence, not intuition." Walter answered without raising his voice. "Then gather one more piece of evidence before you open that operating room." Dr. Hale looked toward the surrounding staff with a smile that invited agreement. "If we delayed surgery every time someone outside the medical team offered advice, this hospital would never save anyone." This time the laughter came more easily, though it sounded forced. I noticed several nurses looking down instead of joining in. Walter simply nodded once, accepting every dismissive word without anger. He glanced at the clock on the wall before meeting Dr. Hale's eyes one final time. "You have less time than you think," he said softly. Then he stepped back into the hallway, leaving behind a silence that somehow felt heavier than the laughter that had tried to bury it. I could still hear the faint laughter long after everyone had returned to work. It was not loud enough to be cruel, but it was quiet enough to linger. Walter never defended himself. He simply rested both hands on the handle of his worn maintenance cart and watched the treatment room door with the same steady patience he had shown every night since I had known him. That bothered me more than Dr. Hale's dismissal. A person who truly believed they were wrong usually argued. Walter did not. He waited. Something inside me refused to let his warning disappear. While another nurse prepared Noah for surgery, I quietly stepped back into the hallway carrying the patient's chart. Walter remained exactly where I had left him, staring at the identification bracelet now resting in my hand. "Please tell me what you saw," I whispered. He looked around to make sure no one else was listening before pointing toward the small red medical alert symbol printed beside Noah's name. "That code is uncommon," he said softly. "Most people never notice it." I frowned. "It only says there is a special medical history." Walter nodded. "Read the medication list again." I opened the electronic chart and slowly scanned every line. allergy information, vaccinations, routine prescriptions. Then my eyes stopped. One medication had been added only 3 months earlier by a pediatric specialist from Boston. I recognized the name but could not immediately remember why it sounded familiar. Walter noticed my hesitation. That medicine is almost never prescribed for ordinary abdominal conditions. My heartbeat quickened. You recognize it? He answered with remarkable certainty. I remember every child who ever needed it. Before I could ask another question, Noah's mother stepped into the hallway wiping tears from her face. She noticed Walter first. Sir, she said quietly, thank you for picking up Noah's bracelet. Walter offered a gentle smile. He is a brave young man. She nodded. He has been fighting a rare condition since he was little. We thought the treatment was finally working. Those words struck me immediately. Rare condition. Treatment. Suddenly the medication name made sense. During my pediatric training, I had attended a lecture about uncommon metabolic disorders that could imitate surgical emergencies. They were unusual enough that many nurses never encountered a single case during their careers. I looked back at Noah's chart with growing concern. Several symptoms matched the lecture almost perfectly. Others did not fit Dr. Hale's diagnosis at all. I hurried toward the laboratory computer and reviewed the newest blood results that had just been uploaded. One value caught my attention, then another. Individually they meant little. Together they formed a pattern that refused to leave my mind. My breathing became slower as doubt quietly replaced confidence. Walter had not guessed. He had noticed something everyone else had overlooked. I turned toward Trauma Room 3, where Dr. Hale was discussing the surgical plan with 2 residents. Every second brought Noah closer to the operating room. I walked toward the doorway, chart pressed tightly against my chest. Dr. Hale, I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. I think we should review these laboratory values alongside Noah's medication history before proceeding. He barely glanced up. We already have our diagnosis. I understand, I replied. But there are findings that deserve another look. One of the residents accepted the chart from my hands and quietly studied the results. His confident expression slowly faded. He looked from the numbers to Noah's bracelet and then back again. Finally, he spoke in a voice much softer than before. Doctor, these findings are unusual. For the first time that night, Dr. Hale stopped giving orders. He reached for the chart himself. Outside the room, Walter remained silent beside his old maintenance cart. But I noticed one small detail that sent a chill through me. He was no longer watching the patient. He was watching the clock. Hospitals have a way of revealing who people truly are when every second matters. Dr. Hale stood motionless for the first time since Noah had arrived, his eyes moving back and forth between the laboratory values and the electronic chart. Around him, the room seemed to hesitate. Nurses who had already begun preparing the operating room slowed their movements without being told. One resident quietly reread the medication history, while another compared Noah's vital signs against the latest blood results. Nobody spoke. The certainty that had filled the emergency department only minutes earlier had begun to crack. Dr. Hale finally lowered the chart. Repeat the metabolic panel, he ordered, and call pediatric genetics. His voice remained confident, but I noticed something new beneath it. Doubt. The laboratory technician hurried away while I stepped back into the hallway. Walter still stood beside his maintenance cart exactly where he had been all night. He had resumed wiping the polished floor with slow, careful strokes as though nothing unusual had happened. Anyone walking past would have assumed he had never spoken a single word about Noah. I approached quietly. They are reviewing everything again, I said. Walter nodded once without looking up. Good. You still have not told me how you recognized that medical alert code. He smiled gently, but instead of answering, he looked toward the hospital entrance. Sometimes answers arrive before questions are finished. I followed his gaze. The automatic glass doors opened, and a wave of cool, rain-soaked air drifted into the brightly lit lobby. 4 men in dark tailored suits entered first, their movements calm, disciplined, and almost silent. They were not hospital security, yet everyone instinctively stepped aside as they crossed the polished floor. Behind them walked a tall man in a charcoal overcoat despite the mild spring rain outside. His posture was relaxed, but the quiet confidence surrounding him seemed to change the atmosphere of the entire lobby. Nurses paused their conversations. Reception staff straightened instinctively. Even the overnight administrator hurried forward without being called. I heard one physician whisper to another, "Vincent Callahan." The name meant nothing to me at first, but the reactions around me said everything. Vincent acknowledged no one as he walked through the emergency department. His gray eyes calmly surveyed every hallway, every waiting area, every face. There was no urgency in his stride, yet everyone unconsciously made room for him. When he reached Noah's mother, Sarah Parker slowly stood from her chair, visibly surprised. Vincent offered a respectful nod. "How is he?" he asked. His voice was steady and unexpectedly warm. Sarah struggled to answer through tears. "They think they know what is wrong. I hope they do." Vincent placed a reassuring hand over hers for only a brief moment. "We will make certain they do." He turned toward the treatment room, then stopped as his eyes settled on Walter quietly mopping the floor a few yards away. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Something unspoken passed between them, not recognition exactly, but familiarity. Vincent gave the slightest inclination of his head. Walter returned the gesture with equal restraint before continuing to guide the mop across the tiles. I watched the exchange with growing confusion. These two men clearly knew something the rest of us did not. Dr. Hale emerged from Trauma Room 3 carrying Noah's chart just as Vincent approached the nurse's station. The surgeon glanced briefly toward the visitors before returning his attention to the laboratory reports. Vincent remained polite. "Dr. Hale." The surgeon nodded. "Can I help you?" Vincent looked toward Walter before speaking. "Perhaps not yet." His calm gaze returned to the surgeon. "But before this night is over, I believe there is one man in this hospital whose voice you will wish you had heard much sooner. There are moments when a person's past refuses to stay buried, no matter how quietly they have chosen to live." Vincent Callahan did not answer Dr. Hale immediately. Instead, he looked through the glass wall into Trauma Room 3, where Noah rested beneath bright examination lights, while nurses quietly adjusted monitors and reviewed fresh laboratory reports. The repeating rhythm of the cardiac monitor blended with the soft hum of ventilators from nearby rooms, creating the familiar soundtrack every hospital employee carried home after a long shift. Vincent finally turned toward Walter, who had resumed polishing the floor as though nothing extraordinary had happened. "Mr. Bennett," he said with genuine respect, "would you join us for a moment?" Walter leaned the mop carefully against the wall before walking over with the same measured pace he always used. Several nurses stopped pretending to organize supplies. They wanted to hear what came next. Dr. Hale folded his arms across his chest. "Do the two of you know each other?" Vincent answered without hesitation. "For many years." The surgeon frowned. "Then perhaps you can explain why a maintenance worker believes he is qualified to question a surgical decision." Walter remained silent, but Vincent's expression softened slightly. "Because he has spent his entire life earning that qualification." Dr. Hale looked puzzled. "I do not understand." Vincent reached inside his coat and removed a slim leather document holder. He handed it to the hospital administrator who had quietly joined the gathering. "Please open it." The administrator hesitated before unfolding several carefully preserved certificates and photographs. His eyes widened almost immediately. "These are medical credentials," he whispered. Another page appeared beneath the first. A framed newspaper article from more than 20 years earlier showed a younger Walter Bennett wearing a white surgical coat while standing beside a team of smiling physicians. The headline described one of the nation's leading pediatric surgeons receiving recognition for groundbreaking work involving rare childhood metabolic disorders. My breath caught. I looked from the photograph to the quiet man standing beside his old maintenance cart. The same gentle eyes, the same calm smile, only older now. The administrator continued reading silently before looking up in disbelief. "Dr. Walter Bennett," he said almost instinctively. The words echoed through the hallway. Every conversation nearby seemed to stop at once. Dr. Hale stared at Walter without speaking. Vincent gently took the article and held it where everyone could see. Dr. Bennett trained some of the finest pediatric specialists in this country. His research is still referenced in teaching hospitals today. Several younger residents exchanged startled glances. One quietly searched Walter's name on a hospital tablet. Within seconds, his eyes grew wide. "His publications are still used during residency," he whispered. Walter lowered his gaze modestly, almost uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Vincent continued. 20 years ago, Dr. Bennett's young daughter developed an extremely rare metabolic illness. Despite every available treatment, she passed away. Afterward, he resigned from surgery, declined every academic appointment offered to him, and disappeared from public medicine. Silence settled over the hallway with surprising gentleness. Nobody reached for a response. Nobody knew how. Walter finally spoke, his voice calm and free from bitterness. There were younger doctors who deserved the opportunities one left behind. Vincent looked at him with quiet admiration. "No, Walter. There was simply a father who could no longer walk into an operating room without remembering the child he could not save. I felt tears gathering before I realized they had started." Suddenly, every small detail made sense. The certainty in Walter's voice, the way he recognized Noah's medication, the sadness that crossed his face when he first touched the medical bracelet. This was not guesswork. It was memory shaped by decades of knowledge and one unimaginable loss. Vincent slowly turned toward Dr. Hale. "The illness that took Walter's daughter is the same rare condition now appearing in Noah Parker." Every eye in the hallway shifted toward the surgeon. For the first time that night, the most respected physician in the hospital stood completely speechless. Knowledge carries a quiet confidence that never needs to announce itself. Arrogance, on the other hand, usually speaks first. Nobody in the emergency department moved after Vincent revealed Walter's past. The only sounds came from the steady monitors inside Trauma Room 3 and the soft rain tapping against the hospital windows. Dr. Hale looked at the old maintenance worker as though he were seeing him for the first time. The confidence that had filled his posture earlier had been replaced by careful uncertainty. He looked down at Noah's chart once again, then back toward Walter. "If what Vincent says is true," he began slowly, "then tell me what you believe we are missing." Walter did not answer immediately. He stepped toward the illuminated monitor displaying Noah's laboratory values, studying each number with remarkable focus. His eyes moved with the calm precision of someone returning to a language he had once spoken every day. He pointed gently to 3 separate results. "These values are unusual on their own," he said softly. "Together they suggest the metabolic crisis is driving the abdominal pain, not the other way around." Several residents leaned closer. One quickly opened a medical reference while another compared Noah's medication history with the latest laboratory findings. Their expressions gradually changed from curiosity to concern. I watched Dr. Hale reread every page without interrupting. The room no longer belonged to titles or reputations. It belonged to the evidence. I stepped beside Walter. "The additional laboratory panel is back," I whispered, handing him the updated results. He studied them for only a few seconds before looking toward Dr. Hale. "Please order the confirmatory metabolic screening before surgery. If those numbers return as I expect, the treatment pathway changes completely." Dr. Hale remained silent. Every eye in the room rested on him. The decision belonged to him, and everyone knew it. Finally, he nodded once. "Cancel transport to the operating room for now," he said firmly. "Run the additional testing immediately." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Nurses redirected medications. Laboratory staff hurried new samples through the system. The surgical team paused their preparations without complaint. Nobody questioned the order because everyone could now see the same possibility beginning to emerge. Noah's mother looked from one physician to another with frightened eyes. "Is my son getting worse?" she asked quietly. Walter walked toward her with the same kindness he had shown the little girl earlier that night. "No," he said gently. We are making sure he receives the right treatment instead of the fastest treatment. She closed her eyes in visible relief before whispering, "Thank you." Walter simply smiled and stepped back. He never tried to become the center of the room. Vincent observed everything from a respectful distance. He never interrupted the medical discussion or attempted to influence clinical decisions. His role had ended the moment people finally chose to listen. He caught my eye for a brief second and gave the slightest nod, as though reminding me that truth only needed one person willing to hear it before it could begin changing everything. 20 minutes later, the laboratory technician returned carrying fresh results. The senior resident reviewed them first. His eyes widened. He handed the report directly to Dr. Hale without saying a word. The surgeon read every line carefully before exhaling slowly. "The metabolic markers are positive," he admitted. Dr. Bennett was correct. Nobody celebrated. The realization carried too much weight for that. Dr. Hale slowly turned toward Walter. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "If we had continued with my original plan, we would have treated the wrong condition." Walter answered with remarkable grace. "Then it is fortunate that we stopped long enough to ask one more question." For the first time since Noah had entered the emergency department, hope no longer came from certainty alone. It came from humility, from listening, and from the quiet wisdom of the one person everyone had almost walked past. Respect is never demanded in the moments that define us. It is quietly earned when no one is watching. The emergency department no longer felt divided by uniforms or job titles. White coats, blue scrubs, and Walter's gray maintenance uniform stood together around the same patient, united by a single purpose. Noah's new treatment began immediately after the confirmatory results arrived. The medications were adjusted. The surgical team stepped back while pediatric specialists joined the consultation through a secure video conference from Boston. Every recommendation they offered matched what Walter had recognized almost an hour earlier. Nobody mentioned coincidence anymore. The room had moved beyond that. I watched Noah's breathing become steadier as the monitors slowly reflected encouraging changes. His mother squeezed my hand so tightly I could feel every tremble in her fingers. "Is he going to be all right?" she whispered. I smiled for the first time since my shift had begun. "He is responding exactly the way we hoped." Tears filled her eyes as relief replaced fear. She looked toward Walter, who remained standing quietly near the doorway as though afraid to interrupt anyone's work. Without hesitation, she walked across the room and embraced him. Walter looked surprised for only a second before gently returning the hug. "Thank you," she whispered through tears. "You saw what everyone else missed." Walter shook his head kindly. Emily saw it too. She chose to ask one more question. That made all the difference. I felt my face grow warm. He could have accepted every word of gratitude for himself, yet he immediately shared the credit. That simple gesture revealed more about his character than every certificate Vincent had displayed. A short time later, the hospital administrator requested that the senior physicians gather in the conference room beside the emergency department. Dr. Hale asked Walter to join them. Walter hesitated. "I am still scheduled to finish cleaning the west hallway before sunrise." Several people smiled softly, but Dr. Hale did not. He stepped forward until he stood directly in front of Walter. The confident surgeon who had dismissed him only an hour earlier now spoke with unmistakable sincerity. "Dr. Bennett," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology in front of everyone who heard my words tonight." The room fell completely silent. "I judged your uniform before I listened to your experience. I believed your job defined your knowledge. I was wrong." Walter looked at him with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the night. "Dr. Hale," he replied gently, "every physician makes difficult decisions. The important ones are those willing to change course when new evidence appears." Dr. Hale lowered his head slightly. "You still chose grace after I showed you none." Walter smiled. "Grace is much easier to carry than pride." Those words seemed to settle over everyone present. Young residents stood quietly against the wall, absorbing every moment. Nurses exchanged thoughtful glances. Even the hospital administrator appeared deeply moved. Vincent remained near the back of the room, saying nothing. He had not exposed Walter's past to embarrass anyone. He had revealed it because one child's future depended on people learning the truth before it was too late. Before the meeting ended, Dr. Hale turned toward the residents. "Remember this night," he said. "The next person who changes your understanding may not be wearing a white coat." No one argued. No one laughed. Every face reflected the same lesson. Titles can open doors, but humility keeps them open. As we stepped back into the emergency department, the first hint of morning light appeared beyond the rain-covered windows. Walter quietly picked up his old maintenance cart exactly where he had left it. Nothing about him had changed. Yet somehow, every person who watched him pass understood they would never look at that gray uniform the same way again. Morning arrived so quietly that none of us noticed the rain had finally stopped. Soft sunlight filtered through the emergency department windows, replacing the cold blue glow of fluorescent lights with something warmer, something that almost made the long night feel worth surviving. Noah remained in the pediatric intensive care unit under close observation, but every update brought encouraging news. His laboratory values continued to improve. His breathing had become steady. The specialists from Boston confirmed that the revised treatment plan was exactly what they would have recommended had they been standing beside us from the beginning. The operating room that had been prepared in such haste the night before now stood empty, and somehow that empty room felt like its own quiet miracle. Sarah Parker had not left her son's bedside except to walk down the hallway once every hour. Each time she passed the maintenance closet, she paused to thank Walter again. He always responded with the same gentle smile and reminded her that Noah had done the hardest part himself by continuing to fight. Late that morning, Noah finally opened his eyes. I happened to be checking his monitors when he looked around the room with sleepy confusion before recognizing his mother sitting beside him. "Mom," he whispered. Sarah immediately leaned forward, tears filling her eyes once more. "I am right here." Noah managed a tired smile before asking the question every child asks after waking inside a hospital. "Can I go home soon?" Sarah laughed softly through her tears. "Not today, but someday very soon." Watching that simple conversation somehow made every exhausting hour of the night worthwhile. Later that afternoon, the hospital board gathered in the main conference room. Word of everything that had happened had spread far beyond the emergency department. Physicians from other departments quietly filled the seats along the walls. Nurses stood near the back. Even members of the housekeeping staff had been invited, something many admitted had never happened before. Walter looked deeply uncomfortable standing at the front of the room beside Vincent and Dr. Hale. He kept smoothing the sleeves of his gray maintenance uniform as though wishing he could quietly return to work instead. The hospital president stepped forward carrying a small wooden presentation box. "Dr. Walter Bennett," she said warmly, "this institution cannot change the years you chose to spend serving without recognition, but we can acknowledge what you have given us today." She opened the box to reveal a hospital medal recognizing extraordinary service to patient care. The room immediately rose to its feet. The applause continued far longer than Walter seemed comfortable with. He accepted the medal only after a long pause before quietly placing it back inside the box. "Thank you," he said, "but if I may ask one favor instead." The room became silent almost instantly. "Please remember the people whose names you do not always know. The housekeeping staff who notices what others overlook. The cafeteria workers who comfort worried families. The receptionists who calm frightened parents before anyone in a white coat arrives. Every person inside these walls serves the same mission. Healing has never belonged to one profession alone." Nobody spoke for several seconds after he finished. The words were too honest to interrupt. Dr. Hale stood first and began applauding again. This time every physician joined him without hesitation. Vincent watched quietly from the side of the room, satisfaction hidden behind his calm expression. He had not changed Walter into a hero. Walter had always been one. Vincent had simply made sure the world finally looked up long enough to see him. As the meeting ended, Walter quietly excused himself, picked up his familiar maintenance cart, and returned to the polished hallways that still needed cleaning. The medal remained tucked inside the wooden box on the conference table, but somehow it no longer mattered. The greatest honor he carried could never fit inside any box. It lived in the steady heartbeat of one young boy whose future had been protected because one quiet man refused to stop paying attention. The smallest acts of kindness often leave the longest echoes. 3 weeks after that unforgettable night, St. Gabriel Medical Center felt different in ways that could not be measured by new policies or renovated hallways. People still hurried through the emergency department. Ambulances still arrived without warning. The monitors still filled the air with their familiar rhythm. Yet something invisible had changed. Doctors greeted the housekeeping staff by name. Nurses paused to thank the people who emptied overflowing trash bins before another family arrived. Even the newest residents learned very quickly that every voice deserved to be heard before any conclusion became final. Noah Parker returned to the hospital on a bright Saturday morning for his follow-up appointment. This time he walked through the front entrance wearing his favorite baseball cap instead of lying on a stretcher. His color had returned. His smile came easily. He carried a small paper bag decorated with hand-drawn stars and carefully asked the receptionist where he could find Mr. Walter. When Walter appeared from the west hallway with his familiar maintenance cart, Noah ran toward him and handed him the bag. Inside rested a simple blue coffee mug with the words, "Heroes notice what others Mississippi." Walter held it quietly for several seconds before smiling with eyes that reflected both gratitude and old memories. "I will treasure this," he said softly. Noah grinned. "Mom says you saved my life." Walter gently shook his head. "A lot of people worked together to help you." Noah thought about that for a moment before answering with the simple honesty only children possess. "Yes, but you were the first one who noticed." Walter could not argue with that, so instead he thanked him for the gift. Nearby, I watched the exchange while finishing paperwork at the nurse's station. Dr. Hale walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. Without saying anything, he handed one to Walter. It was a small gesture, almost ordinary, yet everyone who had witnessed that difficult night understood exactly what it meant. Respect had replaced assumption. Dr. Hale smiled warmly. "I have started adding 1 sentence to every orientation meeting for our new residents." Walter looked curious. "What sentence?" The surgeon answered without hesitation. "Never confuse someone's uniform with the limits of their wisdom." Walter chuckled quietly before taking a grateful sip of coffee. Across the lobby, Vincent Callahan stood near the entrance speaking briefly with the hospital president. As always, he attracted attention without seeking it. Before leaving, he walked toward Walter one final time. "Looks like they finally learned," Vincent said. Walter glanced around the busy hospital where physicians, nurses, technicians, volunteers, and maintenance workers now greeted one another with a little more patience than before. "Learning is never finished," he replied. "It simply begins again every morning." Vincent nodded with quiet admiration. "That is why you always remained the better teacher." He extended his hand. Walter accepted it with a warm smile, and the 2 men parted without ceremony. There were no speeches, no reporters, no cameras waiting outside. Some stories are too meaningful to require applause. As my shift ended, I watched Walter guide his old maintenance cart down the polished hallway once more. The wheels still squeaked softly against the floor just as they had before everything changed. The difference was that now every person who passed him smiled, greeted him, or simply slowed down long enough to say good morning. Walking toward the employee exit, I realized the greatest lesson from that remarkable night had never been about medicine at all. It was about seeing people before judging them, listening before dismissing them, and remembering that the quietest person in the room may be carrying the very answer everyone else has been searching for. Ever since then, whenever I hear the gentle sound of a maintenance cart rolling through a hospital hallway, I remember Walter Bennett and remind myself that true greatness rarely asks to be noticed. It simply shows up every day, does the right thing, and quietly changes lives.